I overheard my daughter-in-law wiring $50,000 to a hitman for my $3 million inheritance. So I faked my death to catch her. She thought she won until I walked down the aisle of my own funeral and tapped her shoulder. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The gavel on my desk didn't make a sound, but the silence following Nicole's voice felt like a death sentence. I stood in the shadows of my own hallway, my phone forgotten at the church, watching my daughter-in-law pace my study through a crack in the door. She looked exactly like the woman I had welcomed into the family 6 years ago, but her voice was a serrated blade. $50,000. Nicole said into her cell phone, her tone as dry as a closing argument. I need it to look like an accident, a burglary gone wrong or a car wreck. Just make it clean. My pulse thrashed against my ribs like a trapped bird. She was talking about me, Evelyn Morrison, the woman who had co-signed her mortgage and hugged her every Christmas. I backed away, my heels silent on the Persian rug, and slipped out the front door into the Atlanta humidity. The steering wheel felt cold and slick under my sweating palms as I sat in my driveway. I am 68 years old, a retired federal prosecutor who spent 35 years putting men in cages for exactly this. I have looked into the eyes of cartel hitmen and mob bosses, but nothing prepared me for the casual cruelty of my son's wife. Nicole wanted my $3 million estate to pay off her failed boutique loans and the lease on a Porsche she couldn't afford. She wasn't waiting for nature to take its course. She was reaching out to a man named Vincent Cruz to hurry it along. I started the engine, the vibration rattling my teeth, and drove until the house was a speck in the rearview mirror. Justice wasn't just my career. It was my DNA, and Nicole had no idea she had just stepped into a courtroom where I owned every seat. I parked 2 blocks away and pulled my secondary phone from the glove box. My hand stopped shaking the moment I dialed my brother Raymond. He was 70, an FBI veteran from the Violent Crimes Division, and the only person who could help me turn a murder plot into a federal sting. "Evelyn, what is it?" he asked, his voice instantly sharp. "Nicole hired a hitman," I said, the words tasting like copper. I overheard the wire transfer details and the timeline. Raymond didn't gasp. He exhaled a long professional breath that told me he was already reaching for a notepad. He told me to go back inside, to act like the doting mother-in-law, and to let the Bureau handle the rest. I turned the car back toward Cascade Heights, my face a mask of practiced warmth. Walking back into my own house felt like entering a lion's den with a stake tied around my neck. Nicole emerged from the study, a bright, rehearsed smile plastered on her face. "Mom Evelyn, you're back early," she chirped, holding up a stack of novels as if they were a shield. "I just brought those books you wanted." I looked at her, seeing the debt and the desperation behind her eyes, and I smiled back. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady enough to fool a polygraph. We took the books to the kitchen, and I watched her pour me a glass of water with hands that didn't tremble once. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the room, a thick layer of soot over everything we had built. Later that night, I sat in the dark of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead. I didn't cry. I calculated. My estate was worth $3.2 million, including the house and my federal retirement accounts. Nicole and Marcus were drowning in $520,000 of debt, a fact I had uncovered months ago but kept to myself out of respect for my son. Now, that respect was a liability. Nicole didn't see me as a person anymore. I was just a barrier between her and a bank balance. I thought about Marcus, my only son, and the crushing blow this would be to him. But I knew the law. If I didn't stop her now, the next time she called Vincent Cruz, I wouldn't be standing in the hallway to hear it. The next morning, I met Raymond at a nondescript diner near the FBI field office. He looked tired, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. "I've talked to my contacts," he whispered over black coffee. "We have a team ready. But Evelyn, this is dangerous. If she suspects you know, the timeline moves up." I slid a folder across the table, containing everything I knew about Nicole's finances. "I want her at my funeral," I said, the plan forming in my mind like a closing statement. "I want her to give the eulogy, to cry for the cameras, and then I want to walk in." Raymond stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You want to fake your death?" he asked. I nodded, my eyes locked on his. "I want a federal conviction that sticks for 25 years, and for that, we need her to believe she won." A week later, the plan was a go. The FBI had flipped Vincent Cruz, Nicole's contact, by threatening him with 20 years on a weapons charge. He was now a cooperating witness, wired for sound, and under total surveillance. I sat in a surveillance van, headphones pressing against my ears, listening as Vincent met Nicole at a crowded coffee shop. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice hushed but eager. Vincent played his part perfectly, grumbling about the risk and demanding the second half of the $50,000. Nicole promised the wire would hit his account the moment the news broke. I watched the grainy feed of her face, looking for a shred of regret, but all I saw was a woman checking her watch. The sun was setting on Tuesday when I stepped out for my final walk. This was the routine Nicole relied on, the 7 p.m. stroll around Cascade Heights that she had described to a killer. I wore my favorite light jacket and walking shoes, feeling the weight of the FBI body armor hidden beneath my clothes. At the corner of Cascade and Fairburn, Vincent stepped out from the shadows of an oak tree. "Give me the purse," he shouted, his voice echoing off the brick houses. I screamed, a raw, terrifying sound that tore through the quiet evening. He lunged, grabbing my arm and shoving me toward the pavement. I hit the ground hard, the impact jolting my spine, and I went perfectly still. I lay there with my eyes closed, listening to the stage chaos. An undercover agent playing a neighbor shouted for someone to call 911. The sirens arrived within minutes, a wailing chorus that signaled the end of my life as Evelyn Morrison. I felt the EMTs lift me onto a stretcher, their movements professional and hurried. They performed fake CPR all the way to Grady Memorial Hospital, where a briefed ER doctor pronounced me dead at 7:47 p.m., cause of death, blunt force trauma, and cardiac arrest. The paperwork was filed, the death certificate was signed, and I was whisked out a back exit into an unmarked SUV. Behind me, the world believed I was a corpse. The FBI safe house in Marietta was quiet, filled with the smell of stale coffee and old wood. I sat on a twin bed, watching the news on a small television. The lead story was the tragic death of a retired federal prosecutor in a botched mugging. I saw footage of my street, the yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the wind. Then, the camera cut to Marcus and Nicole standing on their porch. Marcus was a wreck, his face buried in his hands, but Nicole stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. She looked somber, her eyes appropriately red, but I saw the way she looked at the reporters. She was performing. She was already practicing the role of the grieving heir, and the first wire transfer for the second half of the money was already being traced by Agent Chen. I stayed in that house for 6 days, a ghost watching my own life unfold through a screen. I watched Nicole take charge of the funeral arrangements at Mount Zion Baptist Church, claiming Marcus was too distraught to handle the details. She picked the flowers, the hymns, and most importantly, she insisted on giving the eulogy. We listened to her phone calls, recording every word as she told friends how much she would miss my guidance. Each lie was a fresh brick in the wall of her prison cell. On Friday night, the final $25,000 hit Vincent's account. The trap was set, the bait was taken, And all that remained was the final act of the play. Saturday morning arrived with a clear blue sky. I dressed in a navy blue suit, the same one I had worn to my retirement party. I did my hair and makeup with steady hands, looking at the woman in the mirror, a woman who was supposed to be in a coffin 10 miles away. Agent Chen and his team arrived to escort me, their faces grim. "You ready for this, Evelyn?" he asked, checking his service weapon. I picked up my handbag and stepped toward the door. "I've spent my life following the law," I said. "It's time the law followed me." We drove to the church in silence, the unmarked car weaving through the Saturday morning traffic, toward the place where my friends were gathered to say goodbye to a woman who wasn't dead. The heavy oak doors of Mount Zion Baptist Church stood between me and the end of Nicole's freedom. I could hear the muffled sound of the organ, a somber melody that felt surreal when played for me. Agent Chen checked his earpiece, nodding to the 3 other agents flanking us. The church was at capacity. 300 people gathered to mourn a woman they thought had been murdered for a leather purse. I stood in the vestibule, my breath hitching as I realized the magnitude of the deception I had put my friends and son through. But then, Nicole's voice cut through the air, amplified by the church's sound system, and my resolve hardened into steel. She was at the podium, her voice trembling with a practiced melodic grief. "Evelyn wasn't just my mother-in-law. She was the heart of this family," Nicole sobbed, the sound echoing off the stained glass. I felt a surge of cold fury that eclipsed my fear. I pushed the doors open. The hinges didn't creak, but the shift in light was enough to draw the eyes of the back row. A woman gasped, her program fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. I didn't look at her. I fixed my eyes on the front row, where Marcus sat with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with genuine sobs. I began to walk down the center aisle, my heels clicking on the floor with the rhythm of a ticking clock. The silence spread through the pews like a physical wave. One by one, heads turned, and the murmurs rose into a frantic, confused roar. People stood up, some crossing themselves, others backing away as if I were a specter. I saw my old colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office, men who had seen every horror the city had to offer, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. I kept my pace steady, my gaze locked on the podium. Nicole hadn't seen me yet. She was too busy wiping away fake tears and looking down at her notes. She was talking about my legacy, about the void I had left behind, while the woman she had tried to kill was 20 feet away and closing fast. Marcus was the first to realize. He looked up, his face gaunt and tear-stained, and his mouth fell open. "Mom," he whispered, the word barely audible over the growing chaos. I gave him a short, sharp nod, a signal that I was real, but I didn't stop. I reached the front of the church and stepped up to the podium. Nicole finally looked up, her face a mask of confusion that quickly melted into a terrifying, bloodless white. She stumbled back, the microphone screeching as she bumped it with her elbow. Her eyes were huge, darting toward the exits, but Agent Chen and his team were already moving into position, blocking every door with the quiet efficiency of a closing trap. I reached out and tapped her shoulder, my fingers cold against her silk dress. "Hello, Nicole," I whispered, leaning into the microphone so the entire congregation could hear. The sound of my voice was like a gunshot in the silent room. Nicole fell against the altar, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. "You're dead," she hissed, her voice cracking. I saw the news. I saw the hospital report. I leaned in closer, my eyes boring into hers. "The hospital reported what I wanted you to believe," I said, my prosecutor's voice returning with full authority. "They reported what the woman who paid $50,000 for my murder expected to hear." The church erupted. Marcus stood up, his face a kaleidoscope of shock and dawning horror. "Mom, what is she talking about?" he cried, moving toward us. I turned to the crowd, raising my hand for silence. 6 weeks ago, I overheard a conversation in my own study, I told them, my voice projecting to the back pews. A conversation about a $3 million inheritance and a burglary gone wrong. I watched the realization hit my friends and neighbors. I saw the disgust on their faces as they turned toward Nicole, who was now trembling so hard she could barely stand. I am a retired federal prosecutor, I reminded them, and I know how to build a case that survives any defense. I pulled my phone from my pocket and connected it to the church's audio-visual system, a plan I had coordinated with the technician earlier. Nicole's own voice filled the sanctuary, cold and calculating. I'm sure she's old, the recording played, the audio crisp and undeniable. She's had a good life. My husband and I need that inheritance now. $3 million. That's what we get when she's gone. The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. I watched Marcus collapse back into his seat, his face buried in his hands as he heard his wife gamble his mother's life for a bank balance. Nicole tried to scream, to call it a lie, but the evidence was screaming louder. Agent Chen stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the church lights. Nicole Morrison, you are under arrest for murder for hire conspiracy under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1958, he announced. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Nicole began to wail, a high, thin sound of a cornered animal. This is entrapment! She shrieked as they led her down the aisle. You set me up! I stood at the podium and watched her go, my heart heavy but my mind clear. Entrapment requires me to put the idea in your head, Nicole, I said as she passed. You found the hitman. You wired the money. You wrote the ending. I just changed the cast. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and sobbing reunions. I held Marcus for a long time, apologizing for the pain I had caused him, explaining that it was the only way to ensure Nicole would never have a second chance to hurt us. He didn't care about the deception. He just clung to me, repeating that he thought I was gone. Around us, the reception food that Nicole had ordered was being packed away by the FBI. The church community, once mourners, were now witnesses to a federal crime. I looked at the empty podium where Nicole had stood and felt a strange sense of peace. The case was closed, but the life I had faked was now the only one I had left to live. The news of the funeral arrest went viral within hours. Headline after headline detailed the prosecutor who faked her death to catch her daughter-in-law. I spent the next 3 days at the FBI field office, giving formal statements and preparing for the grand jury. The paper trail was a mile long, the $50,000 in wire transfers, the phone records, and the testimony of Vincent Cruz. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of Nicole's defense. She was held without bail, a flight risk with $500,000 in debt, and no allies left in the world. Marcus filed for divorce on Monday morning, his heart broken, but his eyes finally open. Sitting in my study a week later, I looked at the novels Nicole had brought me that final night. They were props in her play, meant to make her look like a caring daughter-in-law while she waited for the call that I was dead. I realized then that my career hadn't ended when I retired. It had just moved into my own home. My estate was still worth $3.2 million, but its value had changed. It was no longer a target. It was a resource. I updated my will to include a trust for Marcus and significant donations to victim advocacy groups. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The phone rang, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was Agent Chen. Evelyn, the U.S. Attorney wants to talk to you, he said, his voice sounding impressed. They're looking at some other conspiracy cases and want your input as a consultant. I looked out the window at the quiet streets of Cascade Heights, the sun casting long shadows over the pavement where I had fallen for the cameras. My life was my own again, but the world was still full of people who thought they could shortcut justice. I picked up the pen on my desk, the weight of it familiar and comforting. "Tell them I'll be there on Monday," I said. "I think I have a few more things to teach them about how to build a case." The federal detention center smelled of industrial floor wax and despair. I sat on one side of the reinforced glass, watching the door until Nicole was led in by two guards. She looked different without the designer silk and the influencer makeup. Her hair was matted, and the orange jumpsuit washed out her skin until she looked like a faded photograph. She didn't sit down at first. She stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I picked up the handset, my expression neutral. I wasn't there for an apology, and I certainly wasn't there to offer forgiveness. I was there because a good prosecutor always checks the temperature of the defendant before trial. "You think you're so smart," Nicole hissed, her voice crackling through the cheap speaker. "You ruined my life over a few phone calls." I leaned back, the plastic chair creaking under me. "I didn't ruin your life, Nicole." "You put a price tag on mine," I said, my voice low and steady. $50,000 for a woman who treated you like a daughter. You were drowning in $520,000 of debt, and you thought my death was a life raft. Nicole slammed her hand against the glass, the sound echoing in the small booth. "I deserve that money. Marcus and I were struggling while you sat in this house like a queen." The entitlement in her voice was a physical weight. She truly believed that my 35 years of labor belonged to her by right of marriage. "You forgot one thing, Nicole," I told her, my eyes never leaving hers. "I spent my entire career dealing with people who thought they deserved things they didn't earn. I know the look of a predator who thinks they're a victim. You didn't just target a widow. You targeted a federal prosecutor with 53 murder-for-hire convictions. That wasn't just a crime. It was a tactical error." She slumped into the chair then, the fire in her eyes dying down into a cold, dark resentment that I knew would never leave her. I hung up the phone and walked out of the visitors center, the bright Georgia sun blinding me for a moment. Marcus was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his car. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, the stress lines around his eyes deeper. "How is she?" he asked, though I knew he didn't really want to know. "She's exactly who she's always been, Marcus," I said, patting his arm. "She's just not wearing a mask anymore." We drove to a small cafe in Cascade Heights, the neighborhood finally returning to some semblance of normal. People still pointed and whispered when they saw me, the woman who came back from the dead, but the stares were becoming more about respect than shock. Over lunch, Marcus told me he had finally seen the full extent of the debt. Nicole had opened credit cards in his name, forged his signature on personal loans, and even pawned some of my David's old watches that I had given him. The total was even worse than the FBI had initially estimated. It was a systematic stripping of his future, all to fuel an Instagram lifestyle that didn't exist. I watched him realize that the woman he loved was a phantom, a construction of greed and lies. "It's my fault, Mom," he whispered, staring at his sandwich. "I should have seen it." I shook my head firmly. "Some people are professional liars, Marcus. I should know. I spent decades putting them away." The pretrial hearings began a month later. The courtroom was packed with media and law students, all eager to see the funeral prosecutor in action. I sat behind the prosecution table as a consultant, watching my former mentee, David Kim, lead the charge. He was brilliant, laying out the timeline with a precision that left no room for Nicole's defense attorney to breathe. He showed the wire transfers from Nicole's boutique account to the account Vincent Cruz provided. He played the audio of the coffee shop meeting where Nicole described how she wanted me to die. The defense tried to argue that Nicole was under extreme financial duress and wasn't in her right mind, but David shot it down with a single question to the FBI psychologist. Does financial stress usually result in a $50,000 contract killing? The most damning piece of evidence wasn't the money or the recordings. It was the death certificate. David entered it into evidence, then called the ER doctor who had signed it. The doctor testified that the entire thing was a coordinated federal operation. Then, David played the video from the church. The footage showed Nicole at the podium, her face lit with the glow of her own lies, and then the moment I walked through the door. The jury watched her face go white, watched her stumble, and heard her hiss, "You're dead," into the microphone. It was a confession captured in high definition, a reaction that no innocent person would ever have. During a break in the proceedings, Nicole's lawyer approached me in the hallway. He was a shark, a man I had faced many times when I was on the other side. "Evelyn, she's willing to take a plea," he said, his voice hushed. 15 years. She serves 10. I looked at him, the same look I had given every defense attorney who tried to lowball a life. "No," I said, my voice echoing in the marble corridor. She didn't want a plea from me. She wanted me in a coffin. We go to trial, and we go for the maximum. He sighed, knowing I was right. There was no mercy left in the well for Nicole Morrison. The trial lasted 2 weeks, a grueling marathon of testimony and evidence. I took the stand on the final day of the prosecution's case. The room went silent as I was sworn in. I recounted the evening in the study, the sound of Nicole's voice through the door, and the cold realization that my family had become my greatest threat. I described the fear of the staged mugging, the darkness of the safe house, and the weight of the navy suit I wore to the funeral. When David asked me why I went through with such an elaborate plan, I looked directly at the jury. "Because justice needs to be seen to be believed," I said, and Nicole needed to see that her plan didn't just fail, it collapsed. The defense called Marcus to the stand, a desperate attempt to show Nicole as a loving wife who had simply lost her way. It backfired spectacularly. Under cross-examination, Marcus admitted that Nicole had stolen from him, lied about her business, and was already planning how to spend the inheritance before I was even cold. He looked at Nicole from the witness stand, and for the first time, she looked away. The shame was finally starting to seep through her arrogance. By the time the closing arguments were over, the air in the courtroom felt heavy with the inevitable. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours, the same amount of time it had taken Nicole to arrange my death. Guilty on all counts. The word rang out through the courtroom, a rhythmic drumbeat of accountability. Murder for hire conspiracy, wire fraud, solicitation of a crime of violence. Nicole didn't scream this time. She just slumped forward, her forehead hitting the table with a dull thud. I felt a strange lack of triumph. It wasn't about winning. It was about the restoration of balance. The law had been invoked, the evidence had been weighed, and the verdict had been delivered. I walked out of the courthouse with Marcus, the cameras flashing like lightning, but all I could think about was the quiet of my garden back in Cascade Heights. Sentence was set for 2 months later. In the meantime, I began working with the FBI Academy in Quantico, turning my case into a master class for new agents. I showed them how the staging worked, the legal hurdles of the faked death protocol, and the importance of psychological impact in federal stings. I became a consultant for the U.S. Attorney's Office, helping them with complex conspiracy cases that needed a prosecutor's eye. My retirement was busier than my career had ever been, but it was a different kind of work. I wasn't just chasing criminals. I was teaching the next generation how to catch them. The night before the sentencing, Marcus came over for dinner. We sat on the porch, the same porch where Nicole had stood and lied to the world. We talked about his new job, about the debts he was slowly paying off, and about the future. He was dating a woman named Patricia, a kind, quiet teacher who didn't care about inheritance or Instagram. I looked at him and realized that faking my death had given him a new life, too. He was free from the parasite that had been draining him dry. As the sun set over the trees, I realized that the $50,000 Nicole had spent was the best investment she ever made. It just didn't pay out for her. The sentencing hearing was the final chapter of the legal saga, and the air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of old paper and heavy judgment. I sat in the front row, my back straight, watching as the judge reviewed the thick file on his desk. This wasn't just a murder-for-hire case anymore. It was a symbol of elder abuse and calculated greed that had captured the nation's attention. Nicole sat at the defense table, her shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. There were no cameras allowed today, just the quiet, rhythmic scratching of the court reporter's steno machine. It was a day for consequences, not for theater. The prosecutor, David, stood up to deliver the victim impact statement on my behalf, but I put a hand on his arm and shook my head. I wanted to do it myself. I walked to the lectern, the wood smooth under my palms, and looked at the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady. For 35 years, I stood in this room and spoke for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Today, I speak for a woman who was supposed to be a memory. I talked about the betrayal, not just of the law, but of the sacred trust of family. I told him about the $3.2 million that had become a bounty on my head, and the $50,000 that Nicole had treated like a business expense. I turned to look at Nicole, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Her eyes were hollow, filled with the dawning realization that her life was over. "You didn't just try to kill me, Nicole," I said, the words echoing in the silent room. "You tried to kill the very idea of family. You took the love and support I gave you and tried to turn it into a wire transfer." The judge nodded slowly, his face like granite. He asked Nicole if she had anything to say. She stood up, her voice a thin, shaky reed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the word felt empty, a last-minute attempt to shave years off a sentence she had earned in full. The judge didn't blink. "Miss Morrison," he began, his voice booming through the chamber, "you attempted to arrange the demise of your mother-in-law for financial gain. You showed no remorse throughout the trial, only anger at being caught. You used the tools of modern finance to facilitate a prehistoric crime." He paused, the silence stretching until it felt like it might snap. "I am sentencing you to 25 years in federal prison," he declared. "You will serve at least 85% of that sentence." Nicole didn't scream. She just sank back into her chair as the weight of 2 decades crashed down on her. The walk out of the courthouse was the last time I would ever see her as a free woman. I watched the marshals lead her away, the handcuffs glinting in the hallway light. She would be 63 years old before she could even hope to see the sun without a fence in front of it. Marcus was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. He didn't say anything. He just took my hand and we walked toward the car. The debt, the lies, and the murder plot were finally behind us. The $3.2 million was safe, and more importantly, so were we. The case was closed, but the work of rebuilding was just beginning. I returned to Cascade Heights and began the process of purging the house of Nicole's influence. I packed up the books she had brought me, the photos of her and Marcus, and the remnants of the life she had tried to steal. I felt a strange lightness as the boxes left the house. My home felt like mine again, a sanctuary rather than a crime scene. I spent the next few weeks working on my book, The Prosecutor's Target, documenting the legal and psychological aspects of the case. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a manual for survival. I wanted every person who felt a shadow in their own home to know that they had the power to fight back. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the Federal Detention Center. It was from Nicole. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. It wasn't an apology, it was a demand. She wanted me to pay for her appeal, claiming that I owed her for the years I had stolen from her life. I laughed, a sharp, dry sound that startled the cat. The audacity of her greed was truly boundless. I didn't reply. I sent the letter to Agent Chen to be added to her file as evidence of her continued lack of remorse. Some people don't change. They just get more desperate. Nicole was a closed loop, and I was finally outside of it. Marcus and Patricia came over for dinner that Sunday. We sat in the dining room, the table set with the good china David and I had bought 40 years ago. Patricia was a breath of fresh air, genuine, kind, and completely uninterested in my bank balance. We talked about her school, about Marcus's new promotion, and about the vacation they were planning. I looked at my son and saw the man he was becoming without the weight of Nicole's ambition dragging him down. He was happy, truly happy, and that was worth more than every penny in my retirement account. The $3 million would eventually be his, but he no longer needed it to be whole. The FBI called me back to Quantico the following month. They wanted me to help design a new training module on life stage fraud, focusing on how predators target the elderly within their own families. I stood before a room of 50 eager young agents and told them my story, not as a victim, but as a strategist. I showed them the funeral protocol and how we used Nicole's own vanity against her. I saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire I had when I first joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1983. I realized then that my legacy wasn't in my bank account. It was in the hands of these agents who would carry on the fight. My book was published 6 months later and immediately hit the bestseller list. I spent the next few months traveling the country, speaking at law schools and community centers. I met hundreds of women who had been through similar betrayals, women who felt invisible and powerless. I told them my story and watched their shoulders straighten. You are not a target, I told them. You are an expert in your own life. Use that. I became a voice for a generation that was often ignored, and I found a purpose that made my 35 years in the courtroom feel like a rehearsal for the main event. 2 years after the funeral, I stood in my garden at sunset. The roses were in bloom, their scent heavy in the cool evening air. I thought about the night I had stood in the hallway and heard Nicole's voice. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different version of me. I am 70 years old now, and I have never felt more alive. I have survived a murder plot, prosecuted my own betrayer, and built a new life out of the ashes of the old one. I looked at the house, the light spilling out onto the porch, and I smiled. Justice had been served, and for once, the prosecutor was the one who got to go home. I went inside and picked up my phone. I had a call scheduled with a woman in Ohio who thought her nephew was trying to change her will. I sat at my desk, the same desk where Nicole had sat, and planned my demise, and I opened my notebook. Hello? I'm Evelyn Morrison, I said into the phone, my voice warm and steady. Tell me everything you've heard. I started to take notes, the familiar rhythm of the investigation starting up again. I wasn't just a retired prosecutor anymore. I was a shield, and as long as I was breathing, no one was going to take an easy shot at the people I was protecting. The air in the lecture hall at the FBI Academy was perfectly still as I clicked through the final slides of my presentation. I was 71 now, and my voice carried a weight that even the most seasoned instructors respected. This wasn't just a case study for these trainees. It was a lesson in the high-stakes theater of federal law enforcement. I showed them the surveillance footage from the coffee shop one last time, freezing the frame on Nicole's face the moment she confirmed the $50,000 price tag. "Look at her eyes," I told the room. "She's not thinking about murder. She's thinking about a down payment." That's the face of domestic noir in the 21st century. After the lecture, a young agent named Sarah approached me. She had been taking notes so feverishly, I thought she might snap her pen. "Miss Morrison, how did you stay so calm during the faked death?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. I looked at her, seeing the same spark I'd had when I walked into Howard University Law School in 1982. "I wasn't calm, Sarah," I said, leaning against the lectern. "I was professional. There's a difference. Calm is for people who have nothing at stake. Professionalism is what you use when your life depends on every word being a lie." She nodded, recording my answer as if it were scripture. I flew back to Atlanta that evening, the city lights twinkling below like a scattered jar of diamonds. My home in Cascade Heights was waiting for me, but it didn't feel like a lonely fortress anymore. It felt like a base of operations. My book had spawned a foundation, the Morrison Shield, which provided pro bono legal advice to seniors facing financial exploitation. I spent my mornings reviewing cases and my afternoons on the phone with investigators. The $3.2 million that Nicole had coveted was now funding the very justice that had put her away. Every time I signed a check for a legal filing, I felt a sharp, satisfying sting of irony. Marcus called me while I was unpacking. He and Patricia were engaged, and they wanted me to help them pick out a venue. His voice was light, free of the shadow that had hung over him for years. "I'm so happy for you, sweetheart," I told him, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. He had survived the betrayal, too, coming out the other side with a clearer sense of what mattered. He was still paying off the debts Nicole had accrued, but he was doing it with pride, $1 at a time. He refused to let me pay them off for him. "This is my penance, Mom," he had said, "and my path back to being the man you raised." The next day, I received a notification from the Bureau of Prisons. Nicole had been moved to a medium security facility in Florida. Along with the notification was a request for a victim offender mediation session. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the delete key. She wanted to explain her side of things, the letter said. I knew exactly what that meant. She wanted a stage. She wanted to try one last time to manipulate the narrative. I didn't delete the request. Instead, I forwarded it to my publisher. If she wanted to talk, she could do it on the record for the sequel. I had no interest in her explanations, only in her transparency. I spent the weekend at a cabin in the North Georgia mountains, a place David and I used to go when the city got too loud. I sat on the deck, watching the fog roll over the Blue Ridge peaks, and I thought about the 53 murder-for-hire cases I had prosecuted before I became the 54th. I realized that the law is a living thing, a constant struggle between those who want to take and those who want to protect. Nicole had tried to take, and in doing so, she had given me more than she ever could have stolen. She gave me a second act that was louder and brighter than the first. I picked up my pen and started writing the first chapter of my next book. Monday morning brought a new challenge. A woman named Beatrice from a small town in South Georgia had called the foundation. Her grandson had moved her into a nursing home and was selling her farm without her permission. I didn't just send a lawyer. I drove down there myself. I walked into that nursing home wearing a power suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it held a federal indictment. When the grandson saw me, he turned pale, much like Nicole had at the funeral. He knew exactly who I was. The funeral prosecutor had arrived, and his little scheme was over before he could even finish his coffee. We got Beatrice's farm back within 48 hours. The grandson was looking at felony fraud charges, and the local sheriff was more than happy to help me build the case. As I drove back to Atlanta, Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, her hands clutching her old leather purse. "I don't know how to thank you, Evelyn," she whispered. "You don't have to," I told her, reaching over to pat her hand. "You just have to stay aware. And if anyone ever asks about your will again, you tell them you have a friend in Atlanta who's very good at faking her own death." She laughed, a bright, resilient sound that filled the car. Back in my study, I looked at the framed letter from the woman in Ohio who had saved her own life by reading my book. It was the centerpiece of the room now, more important than any award or diploma. I realized that my 35 years as a prosecutor were just the prologue. The real work was here, in this room, with this phone and this story. I am 71 years old, and I have never been more dangerous to people who think they can prey on the vulnerable. I looked at the clock. It was 7:00 p.m., the time I used to take my walk. I put on my shoes and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet. I walked the same route I had taken on that Tuesday 2 years ago, the route where Vincent Cruz had been waiting. I reached the corner of Cascade and Fairburn and stopped. There were no cameras now, no undercover agents, just me and the evening shadows. I looked at the spot where I had fallen and felt a surge of triumph. I was still standing, I was still walking, and I was still watching. I turned the corner and headed back home, my pace steady and my heart full. The story wasn't over. It was just getting to the good part. I reached my front door and let myself in, the house warm and welcoming. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, thinking about the glass Nicole had poured for me. I drank it slowly, savoring the clarity of it. Tomorrow, I had a meeting with the U.S. Attorney to discuss a new racketeering case. Tomorrow, I had a call with a producer about a documentary. Tomorrow, I had a lunch with Marcus and Patricia. My life was full. My conscience was clear, and my enemies were exactly where they belonged. I turned off the light and went upstairs. The silence of the house no longer a threat, but a reward. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the photo of David on the nightstand. "I think you'd be proud of me," I whispered to the empty room. "I didn't just survive. I won. And I did it using the very things we spent our lives defending." I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the day lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The world thought I was a victim, then they thought I was a ghost, but they finally knew the truth. I am Evelyn Morrison, and I am still the most formidable person in the room. The federal courthouse in Tallahassee felt like an oven, the Florida heat pressing against the glass as I walked in for Nicole's first appeal hearing. I was 71, and while my joints ached from the flight, my mind was a sharpened instrument of war. Nicole sat behind the defense table, her orange jumpsuit replaced by a cheap gray suit that hung off her thinning frame. She looked toward the gallery, her eyes scanning for Marcus, but he wasn't there. He was back in Atlanta, preparing for his wedding to Patricia. I sat in the front row, a physical reminder of the woman she had tried to erase for $50,000. Her new attorney, a public defender with a tired face and a mountain of files, argued that the funeral theater had prejudiced the jury. He called the staged death an elaborate trap that coerced a confession through shock. I watched the appellate judges, 3 men with faces like parchment, as they listened to the recording of Nicole's voice through the church speakers. "I'm sure she's old. She's had a good life," the recording echoed, chilling the air-conditioned room. My heart didn't even skip a beat. I had prosecuted cases like this for 35 years. I knew that evidence of intent trumps, evidence of theatricality every single time. The lead judge leaned forward, his spectacles sliding down his nose. Miss Morrison was a retired federal prosecutor, he noted, looking at me and then at Nicole. She understood the elements of the crime better than most. Is it the defense's position that her presence at her own funeral forced your client to wire the final $25,000 3 days prior? The attorney stammered, his argument collapsing under the weight of the $50,000 total payment Nicole had already completed. I let out a slow, controlled exhale. The law wasn't a game of feelings. It was a ladder of facts, and Nicole was at the very bottom. During the recess, I stood in the hallway, watching the palm trees sway outside. A woman approached me, her eyes darting toward the courtroom doors. "Are you Evelyn Morrison?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. I nodded, offering the professional smile that had seen me through 200 federal cases. "My daughter-in-law is doing the same thing," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched a floral handbag. "She's asking about my $900,000 house and my life insurance." I reached into my bag and handed her the contact card for Agent Chen at the FBI. "Don't wait for the funeral," I told her. "Start the case today." When the hearing resumed, the judges took less than 20 minutes to deny the appeal. The conviction stood. The 25-year sentence was a hard lock. Nicole was let out, and as she passed me, she hissed a single word: "Ghost." I didn't flinch. I had spent my life hunting ghosts in the criminal justice system, men and women who thought they were invisible until the handcuffs clicked. I walked out into the Tallahassee sun, the humidity no longer a burden, but a reminder that I was breathing, living, and winning. I flew back to Atlanta that night, the city lights reflecting off the wing of the plane. My mind was already on the next task. The $3.2 million estate was now more than just assets. It was a weapon. I had established the Morrison Shield Foundation to help women like the one I had met in the hallway. We were currently investigating 3 cases of elder financial abuse, using the $1.8 million in my retirement accounts to fund the investigations. Nicole had wanted the money to buy a Porsche. I was using it to buy justice for people who couldn't afford the down payment. Back in Cascade Heights, the house felt silent but full. I sat at my desk and opened the latest report from the FBI on Vincent Cruz. He was still cooperating, helping the Bureau take down a larger ring of solicitations in the Southeast. My faked death hadn't just caught Nicole. It had created a ripple effect that was pulling other predators out of the shadows. I looked at the $180,000 credit card debt Nicole had hidden from Marcus, a debt that was now being slowly eroded by his honest work. Balance was returning to my world, $1 and one day at a time. I received a package the next morning. It was a pre-release copy of my book, The Prosecutor's Target. The cover was a stark image of a gavel and a single black rose. I flipped to the chapter titled The Funeral Protocol, where I detailed how we used the Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office to issue a fabricated death certificate. It was surreal to see my own life formatted into a teaching manual, but it was necessary. I wanted every predator to know that the woman they were targeting might just be the one who wrote the book on their destruction. Marcus and Patricia came over that evening for a celebratory dinner. Patricia was a teacher, a woman who understood the value of $0 compared to the value of character. We sat on the porch, the same porch where the FBI had recorded Nicole's fake grief. Marcus looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time in years. "Mom, I'm glad you're a ghost," he joked, but the underlying gratitude was thick in the air. He was free from the $520,000 total debt Nicole had nearly drowned him in, and he was building a life based on truth. As the sun dipped below the trees, I thought about the life Nicole was living in FCI Tallahassee. She would be 63 when she got out. 25 years of thinking about the $3 million she almost had. I went inside to answer a call from a news program in New York. They wanted to discuss the theatrics of justice. I adjusted my glasses and picked up the handset. Justice isn't theater, I told the producer. It's a conviction, and I have 200 of them to prove it. I hung up and walked to the window. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights flickering on one by one. I remembered the scream I had let out at the corner of Cascade and Fairburn, a scream that had started this whole journey. It felt like a different life, a different woman. I was no longer the intended victim. I was the architect of a new kind of survival. I turned off the study light. The darkness no longer a place for secrets, but a place for rest. Tomorrow, I would fly to Quantico to speak to a new class of agents. Tomorrow, I would check the progress of the Morrison Shield cases. Tomorrow, I would be Evelyn Morrison, the woman who faked her death to find her life. I walked up the stairs, my steps light and purposeful. The story of the hitman and the funeral was over, but the story of the prosecutor was just beginning. I reached the landing and paused, my hand on the banister. A light flashed in the driveway. A car I didn't recognize was idling at the curb. The headlights cut through the darkness of my driveway, twin beams of cold light that made my pulse spike. I didn't call out. I didn't move toward the window. I stepped back into the shadow of the hallway, my hand instinctively reaching for the phone I now kept on me at all times. This was the muscle memory of 35 years in federal law enforcement. I watched the car, a dark sedan, nondescript, until the engine cut out and a figure stepped out. My heart hammered against my ribs, the same frantic rhythm I'd felt when I heard Nicole's voice in my study. The figure walked toward the porch, their steps heavy and deliberate. I slipped into the kitchen and grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove, my eyes never leaving the front door. Through the side light, I saw a face illuminated by the porch light. It wasn't a hitman. It was Marcus Chen, the FBI agent who had helped me stage my death. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding, the iron skillet feeling suddenly foolish in my hand. I opened the door before he could even knock. Agent Chen looked tired, his suit wrinkled and his tie loosened. "Evelyn, I apologize for the hour," he said, stepping into the foyer. I saw the grim set of his jaw and knew this wasn't a social visit. "What's happened?" I asked, leading him into the study. "Is it Nicole?" He sat in the chair where I had once imagined her sitting while she planned my demise. "No," he said. "It's Vincent Cruz. He's gone missing from the halfway house in Jacksonville." The air in the room went cold. Vincent was the key to the entire case, the man who had recorded the $50,000 deal and testified to the $25,000 wire transfers. If he was gone, it meant someone was cleaning up loose ends. "We think he was intercepted," Chen continued, "and we found a burner phone in his locker. The last 3 calls were to a number registered to Nicole's failed boutique." My blood turned to ice. Nicole was in federal prison, but her reach was longer than I had estimated. I spent the next 4 hours at my desk, working with Chen to trace the connections we had missed. Nicole's $520,000 debt hadn't just been to banks. There were personal loans of $50,000 from predatory lenders. We realized that the hitman, Vincent Cruz, might have been part of a much larger network of debt collection that Nicole had tried to exploit. I was no longer just a victim of a daughter-in-law's greed. I was a witness in a federal racketeering case I hadn't even known existed. By dawn, the FBI had a surveillance team back on my house. Marcus was safe with Patricia at a secure location, but I refused to leave Cascade Heights. This was my home, the place where I had prosecuted 53 murder-for-hire cases from my kitchen table. I wasn't going to be driven out by a ghost in a jumpsuit. I spent the morning reviewing the boutique's old records, looking for the name that had surfaced on Vincent's burner phone. The landlord. It was a name I recognized from a RICO case I had prosecuted in 1998. A man who specialized in liquidating debts for failing businesses. Nicole hadn't just hired a hitman. She had sold my $3.2 million estate to a shark to pay off her $180,000 credit card bills. The $50,000 was just the down payment for a much larger takeover. I realized then that my faked death hadn't just fooled Nicole. It had interrupted a corporate hit on my life. I called Assistant Special Agent in Charge Jennifer Williams. "We need to squeeze the lenders," I told her, my prosecutor's voice echoing off the walls. "Use the $90,000 car loans and the Porsche lease as leverage. If we can show they were colluding with Nicole to accelerate the inheritance, we have them on conspiracy." She agreed, and within 6 hours, the FBI was raiding 3 storefronts in North Atlanta. The pressure worked. By Tuesday evening, one of the lenders flipped. He confirmed that Nicole had promised them the house in Cascade Heights as collateral for a $200,000 business loan she'd never intended to pay back. The accident Vincent was supposed to arrange wasn't just for Nicole's inheritance. It was to satisfy a debt that was spiraling out of control. I sat in the FBI van, listening to the confession, feeling a grim satisfaction. I hadn't just survived a family betrayal. I had dismantled a criminal enterprise. But the victory felt hollow. Vincent Cruz was still missing. I went to the federal detention center to face Nicole one last time. She was in isolation now, her face gaunt and her eyes wild. "Where is Vincent?" I asked, the glass between us feeling like a thin shield. She laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You think you won because you walked into a church, Evelyn? You don't know the people I owe. They don't care if you're alive. They just want the address." I walked out of the prison, the Tallahassee wind whipping my hair. I knew she was lying about the fear, but she was telling the truth about the danger. The $3 million inheritance was still a target, and I was the only thing standing in the way of the payout. I drove back to my hotel, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. I was 71 years old, a retired federal prosecutor, and I was back in the middle of a war I had thought I'd already won. I reached my hotel room and locked the door, sliding the chain into place. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop, looking at the draft of my book. I deleted the final chapter. The story wasn't over. I looked at the contact list on my phone and dialed Agent Chen. "I have an idea," I said, "but it requires another funeral." The line went silent for 3 seconds before Chen spoke. "Evelyn, you can't be serious." The air in the basement of the FBI field office was cold, smelling of ozone and old electronics. I stood before a map of Atlanta, a series of red pins marking the locations of the predatory lenders and the boutique Nicole had used as a front. Agent Chen and Assisi Williams stood beside me, their faces illuminated by the glow of a dozen monitors. We weren't staging a death this time, we were staging a payout. If the landlord wanted the $3.2 million estate, we were going to give it to him, on paper. The plan was a controlled liquidation. We leaked a story to a local financial blog that Marcus was selling the house in Cascade Heights to cover his late wife's debts. The $900,000 property was the bait. We created a fake escrow account, monitored by the FBI's cybercrimes unit, and waited for the shark to bite. I sat in a secure room for 3 days, watching the digital pings as the landlord's associates began to circle the assets. They thought they were finally getting the $520,000 they were owed, plus interest. On Thursday, the phone rang. It was the landlord. He didn't use a burner this time. He was confident. He called the number we had set up for the fake escrow agent. "I want the deed to the Cascade property," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "and tell the kid Marcus that if he moves a single stick of furniture, he's going to join his mother." I felt a surge of cold fury, but I kept my voice neutral as I coached the undercover agent on the other end of the line. We arranged a meeting at a high-end restaurant in Buckhead, neutral ground, for a $3 million handover. I wasn't on the guest list, but I was in the kitchen, wearing a headset and watching the surveillance feed. Agent Chen was at a nearby table, posing as a businessman. We saw the man enter, a tall, silver-haired professional who looked more like a banker than a Rico target. He sat down, placed a leather briefcase on the table, and asked for the paperwork. The undercover agent slid a folder across the table. Inside were the deeds to the house and the $1.8 million retirement accounts. The silver-haired man smiled, the same predatory smile I had seen on Nicole when she brought me those books. He opened the briefcase to show the receipts for Nicole's debts, including the $50,000 contract for my accident. It was the final piece of evidence we needed, a direct link between the lenders and the murder-for-hire plot. "Move in," Williams whispered into the comms. The arrest was silent and swift. The Buckhead diners didn't even look up from their salads as 4 men in suits surrounded the table. The landlord didn't fight. He just looked at the handcuffs and then at the camera in the ceiling. He knew the game was up. In the kitchen, I leaned against the stainless steel counter, my legs suddenly shaky. We had the lenders, we had the landlord, and we had the proof that Nicole had been a pawn in a much larger game of financial slaughter. But we still didn't have Vincent Cruz. I walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room, coming face to face with the man they called the landlord as he was being led out. He stopped, his silver eyes narrowing as he looked at me. "You're the one," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The prosecutor who wouldn't stay dead." I looked at him, my chin high. "I'm the one who's sending you to the same place I sent Nicole," I said. He laughed, a quiet, chilling sound. "You think this ends with me?" "Check the freezer in the boutique, Evelyn." The drive to Nicole's old boutique was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The FBI broke down the door, their flashlights cutting through the dust of the abandoned shop. We found the freezer in the back, behind a rack of moth-eaten dresses. Agent Chen opened it, and for a moment, the only sound was the hum of the cooling unit. Vincent Cruz was there, alive, but barely. He had been kept on ice, literally and figuratively, to ensure he wouldn't testify at the appeal. We got him to the hospital, and by Friday morning, he was talking. He confirmed that the landlord had been the one to suggest the $50,000 price tag to Nicole, knowing she couldn't pay it without the inheritance. It was a setup within a setup. They had wanted her to fail so they could seize the $3.2 million estate under the guise of debt collection. My daughter-in-law wasn't just a killer. She was a fool who had tried to play with sharks. I returned to Cascade Heights on Saturday morning. Marcus and Patricia were waiting for me on the porch, their faces etched with relief. We sat in the living room, the house finally feeling like a home again instead of a battleground. I told them everything, from the Buckhead arrest to the discovery of Vincent Cruz. Marcus took a long breath, looking at the $900,000 house around him. "It's just a building, Mom," he said. "I'm glad you're the one in it." I spent the rest of the day in my study, finalizing the second edition of my book. I added a new chapter, The Shark's Debt. I wanted people to understand that greed isn't just a family affair, it's an industry. I looked at the $3.2 million figure in my ledger and realized that I was finally at peace with the money. It was no longer a bounty. It was a legacy of survival. I was 71, and I had survived the hitman, the funeral, and the landlord. The phone rang at 7 p.m. I picked it up, expecting a news producer or a trainee. "Hello?" I said. There was a long silence on the other end. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 2 years spoke. A voice that was supposed to be in a federal cell in Florida. "Hello, Evelyn," Nicole whispered. "The landlord isn't the only one with friends." The silence on the line was a cold, physical weight. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't scream. I sat in my study, the shadow of the oak tree outside stretching across my desk like a dark hand. Nicole's voice was different. No longer the melodic chirp of the doting daughter-in-law or the hysterical screech of the convict. It was hollow, the sound of someone who had nothing left to lose but the time they were serving. I realized then that the landlord's arrest hadn't just closed a case. It had triggered a contingency. "How are you calling me, Nicole?" I asked, my voice as steady as a federal indictment. I was already pressing the silent alarm button under my desk, a direct line to Agent Chen's office. I heard a faint, rhythmic clicking on the other end, the sound of a prison phone system, or perhaps something more illicit. "The landlord had a lot of debts, Evelyn," she whispered, "and some of those debts are being paid in favors. I'm not in Tallahassee anymore." My blood turned to ice. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the quiet street of Cascade Heights. The FBI surveillance van was gone. I had dismissed them only 6 hours ago, thinking the threat had ended with the Buckhead arrest. I was 71 years old, alone in a $900,000 house, with a woman who had already paid $50,000 once to see me in the ground. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping her on the line to allow the trace to complete. "I want the $3 million you stole from me," she hissed, the entitlement finally boiling over. "I want the life I was supposed to have before you walked into that church." I looked at the $3.2 million figure in my records and realized that to Nicole, I wasn't a person. I was a bank vault that refused to open. "You didn't have a life, Nicole," I told her. "You had a $5,000 to $20,000 debt and a Porsche lease you couldn't afford. You traded your freedom for a dream that was already dead." The front door clicked. I didn't panic. I stood up, moved to the heavy oak door of my study, and locked it. I heard footsteps in the foyer. The same foyer where Nicole had once brought me paperback novels. These steps were light, practiced. "I'm in the house, Evelyn," she said into the phone, the voice on the line now echoed by a voice in the hallway. I realized then that the favor hadn't just been a phone call, it had been an escape. I picked up the iron skillet I had kept near my desk since the landlord's threat. I am a retired federal prosecutor. I have spent 35 years dealing with the worst humanity has to offer. I wasn't going to die in my study. "The police are already on their way, Nicole," I shouted through the door, "and the FBI has the recording of this call. You're just adding years to a life sentence." The door handle turned, then rattled violently. "I don't care about years," she screamed, her voice finally breaking. "I want my money." I heard the wood splinter as she threw her weight against the door. I stepped back, my eyes fixed on the latch. This was the final confrontation, the one I had avoided by faking my death the first time. I realized that you can't outrun a shark by pretending to be a ghost. You have to face the teeth. The door burst open. Nicole stood there, her eyes wild, her face gaunt from 2 years in a cell. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a heavy brass lamp from the hallway. She lunged, but I didn't cower. I swung the skillet with the strength of a woman who had spent 40 years fighting for her life. The iron met the brass with a sickening clang. Nicole stumbled back, the lamp falling to the Persian rug. She looked at me, shock replacing the rage in her eyes. You were supposed to be an old woman," she gasped. "I am an old woman, Nicole." I said. Standing over her, she collapsed to the floor. But I'm an old woman who spent 35 years sending people like you to prison. You underestimated me when you hired Vincent, and you underestimated me tonight. Blue and red lights began to flash against the study walls as the sirens finally reached the driveway. Agent Chen burst into the room, his weapon drawn, but he stopped when he saw me standing over my daughter-in-law. The arrest was quick. Nicole didn't fight as they led her out for the second time. She didn't scream about entrapment or inheritance. She just stared at me with a hollow, broken expression. She was going back to prison, this time for escape and attempted murder, with no hope of ever seeing the $3.2 million estate. I watched the ambulance take her away. Then I sat on my porch and watched the sun come up over Cascade Heights. Marcus and Patricia arrived an hour later, held me, and wept. We spent the morning talking to the FBI, documenting the favors the landlord had used to get Nicole out of her cell. It was a massive conspiracy that would lead to 20 more arrests. But for me, it was finally the end of the story. I looked at my house, the $900,000 building that had been a target for so long, and realized it was finally just a home. I finished my book that afternoon. The final sentence wasn't about the funeral or the hitman. It was about the power of knowing exactly who you are. I am Evelyn Morrison. I am 71 years old. I have survived a murder-for-hire plot, a federal racketeering ring, and an escape attempt. I am a retired federal prosecutor, a mother, and a survivor. I looked at the $3.2 million in my trust and signed a check to the National Center on Elder Abuse for half of it. I didn't need the millions to be a queen. I just needed to be the woman who stayed standing. The neighborhood is quiet now. Marcus and Patricia were married last month in a small ceremony in my garden. There were no faked deaths, no secret wires, just a mother watching her son find the happiness he deserved. I still work with the FBI, and I still teach at the academy, but I also spend my time in the garden, tending to the roses that Nicole had once ignored. I am still here. I am still fighting, and I am still watching. Because as I told that room full of agents in Quantico, knowledge is power, and justice is a long game. I turned off the light in my study and walked up the stairs, my steps firm and steady. The story of the hitman and the funeral was over. The story of my life was just beginning. I reached the landing and smiled. The roses are beautiful this year. Would you like me to tell you how I grew them? If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.